Listen to Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Level A2, Oxford Reading University. Part 2. You can find Part 1 in the description.
Spring came. The days got longer and warmer, and the March sisters found many new things to do. They kept their old traditions, too. One of them was the Pickwick Club. In Charles Dickens' novel, The Pickwick Papers, was a writers' club for men. The girls created a similar organization for women. They produced a newspaper called The Pickwick Portfolio. They were all authors, and Joe was the editor. One day, after reading the newspaper aloud, Joe said, "I would like to accept a new member into our society, Mr. Theodore Lawrence. I think he will do the paper a lot of good." "Let's ask the rest of the members," said Meg, the president of the club. 2 members of the club, Joe and, surprisingly, Beth, wanted to accept Laurie. Meg and Amy were against it. "Boys are very noisy. This is an all-female club. We don't want any noise here," Amy said. "And I am afraid that he will laugh at our paper," Meg added. "Laurie is a gentleman. He will never do anything like that," Joe disagreed. In the end, the girls had to agree, and then Joe opened the closet door. Laurie was hiding inside the whole time. "Thank you for accepting me into the club," Laurie said. "Allow me to give you a present as a sign of friendship." His gift was a mailbox. It was put between their houses. They could drop letters, materials for their paper, and all sorts of things there. Everyone enjoyed this activity. Even old Mr. Lawrence sometimes passed a funny note through the box. 6. One day, Joe took her stories to a newspaper office. She hoped that the newspaper could print them. On her way back, she met Laurie and told him about this. He shared a secret with her in return. Laurie thought that Mr. Brooke, his teacher, was in love with Meg. He noticed that Mr. Brooke carried Meg's glove around with him. In Laurie's opinion, that was a sign of love. Joe hated this. She felt like Mr. Brooke was trying to take Meg away from the March family. A couple of weeks later, Joe came home with a newspaper. She looked very excited. She sat down and started reading it. "Are you reading anything interesting?" Meg asked, passing by. "Nothing. It is just a story," Joe replied. "You should read it aloud then," Amy said. Joe read the story to the sisters. They liked it a lot. It was a sad love story, and most of the characters died in the end. "Who wrote it?" Beth asked. Joe stood up and said proudly, "Your sister, Joe." Everyone was excited and happy for Joe. They asked her many questions. How did it happen? How much money did she earn? What will Father say? "They didn't pay me this time," Joe explained. "They don't pay beginners. But the story was printed, so maybe someone will notice me." 7. In November, Mrs. March received a telegram. It said that her husband was very ill and she had to visit him at the hospital in Washington, D.C. She didn't have enough money, so she borrowed some from Aunt March. The sisters and Laurie helped Mrs. March pack and get all the necessary things for her travel. Soon, Joe left, but she didn't tell anyone where she was going. Beth was sent to Mr. Lawrence to get a couple of bottles of wine from him. She came back together with the old gentleman. He offered Marmee all possible help and even wanted to go with her. "But no, Mr. Lawrence, the journey will be too long and hard," Mrs. March replied. "I have an idea," Mr. Lawrence said. Then he sent for Mr. Brooke. It turned out that Mr. Brooke could travel together with Mrs. March. "I will help your mother and also do some business for Mr. Lawrence in Washington, D.C., he told the sisters. "You are so kind," Meg said. "It is nice to know that someone will take care of Mother while she is away." Suddenly, the door opened and Joe came in. She was wearing a wool hat. She gave her mother $25. "This is to make Father comfortable and to bring him home," she said. "My dear, where did you get it?" Mrs. March asked. "I sold my hair," Joe said, taking her hat off. Everybody was shocked. "Oh, Joe, how could you? It was your only beauty," Amy cried. "It is fine," Joe replied. "My head feels cool and light, and short hair is so much easier to manage. I wanted to be helpful to Father in some way, and I couldn't think of anything else." Joe wanted to seem okay with losing her hair. However, at night, she cried about it a little. 8. Before Mrs. March went away, the girls promised to work hard and look after each other. For some time, the sisters kept their promise, but soon they became lazy. Mrs. March also asked them to help a poor family, but only Beth did it. One day, she visited the family and came back very sad. "Their baby died of scarlet fever," Beth told the other girls, "and I think I caught the disease." Beth fell very ill. Everyone thought she was certainly going to die. The sisters wrote a letter to Mrs. March asking her to come back as soon as possible. Luckily, when she came, Beth felt better. However, the girl was in much weaker health than before. One evening, Mrs. March was sitting next to Beth's bed when Joe entered the room. "I want to tell you something, Mother," she said. "About Meg?" Mrs. March asked. "How quickly you guessed! It is a little thing, but it worries me. Joe replied. You see, last summer, Meg left her gloves at the Lawrences, but only one of them was returned. Some time ago, Laurie told me that Mr. Brooke has the other glove and carries it around. Laurie thinks he does it because he likes Meg, but he is afraid to tell her because he is poor and she is very young. Do you think Meg likes him? Mrs. March asked. Mother, please, I don't know anything about love, Joe cried. So you think she isn't interested in John? Joe didn't understand. John? Who is John? I am talking about Mr. Brooke, Mrs. March replied. I started calling him John when we traveled together. We became great friends. He helped you take care of Father, and now you will let him marry Meg, Joe cried. Joe, dear, don't be angry, Mrs. March said softly. John says he loves Meg, but he doesn't want to ask her to marry him while he is still poor. Also, I don't wish Meg to marry before she is 20. I want her to marry Laurie and become rich, Joe said. I am afraid that Laurie is too young for her, Marmee answered with a smile. But don't tell Meg anything about the matter just yet. When John comes back and I see them together, I will understand what her feelings are. 9. Joe didn't tell Laurie about Meg and Mr. Brooke's potential relationship. Laurie saw that Joe kept some secret from him, and this made him unhappy. He decided to play a joke on them and wrote a love letter signed Mr. Brooke. Meg answered the letter and received a reply. Dear Meg, I never wrote a love letter to you. It was some kind of joke. Soon, Laurie understood that it was a bad joke. He told Meg and Joe all about it, and he was sorry. One day, Mr. Brooke came to the March house to pick up his forgotten umbrella. Meg met him in the hall. They talked a little, and then he took her by the hand and asked, Don't you love me at least a little? I love you very much. I am too young, Meg replied. Her heart started beating faster. Maybe you will learn to love me later, Mr. Brooke asked. It will not happen soon, Meg said. Now, please, could you go away? At that moment, the door opened and Aunt March came in. John went to the living room and Meg stayed in the hall. Her face was red. What is going on? Aunt March asked. Nothing. Mr. Brooke and I were just talking, Meg replied. Mr. Brooke, the boy's teacher? It is all clear now. I made Joe tell me everything. Aunt March said in an angry voice, I know you want to marry him, but if you do, you will never get any money from me. These words made Meg change her mind immediately. I will marry John if I decide so, she cried. He is poor, but Mother and Father like him. We will work very hard and earn enough money." "Then don't expect to get any help from me," Aunt March said, leaving the room. John came back and hugged Meg. "So, you do love me, at least a little?" he asked again. "Now I know I do, because I had to protect you," she replied. Everyone was happy for Meg and John that evening, except for Jo. She thought she was about to lose her dear friend, but when she saw how excited everyone was, she tried to accept the situation. 10. 3 years passed. The war was finally over, and Mr. March was back home. Laurie was at college, and Jo wrote stories for a newspaper. All of the sisters were a little bit different now, as their personalities developed over time. Meg's wedding was small and simple. They all celebrated, and then Meg left, telling her family not to forget her. Jo continued to write books. She worked on a novel that was very dear to her heart. One day, when she took a break from writing, she went to a lecture. There, she sat next to a boy that was reading a newspaper. She looked at the image on the page for a long time, and the boy noticed her interest. He offered her the newspaper, and she read the story. It seemed stupid to Jo. There was, however, an advertisement on the page. And so Jo learned about a competition for authors of sensationalist stories. The prize was $100. It was a chance for Jo to earn money, and she took it. She began to work hard on her story. When it was finally finished, she sent it and waited. She kept her plan a secret. 6 months later, a letter arrived. Jo opened it, and a check for $100 fell out. She read the letter and began to cry. The gentleman who wrote it was very kind. Jo used the money to send Marmee and Beth to the seaside. She wrote more stories and earned a lot of money. Finally, she managed to finish her novel too. The publisher told her to make it shorter. She did not want to do it, but it really was a necessary step. Soon, the book was published. Jo received $300 for it, and a lot of different opinions. Some readers loved the book. Others hated it. Jo did not know how to react. What exactly did I do right? And what did I do wrong? She asked herself. At first, she was sad. After some time, however, she started seeing the situation as a good lesson. She hoped to write a better book in the future.
Part 3 is coming soon. Learning English is boring. Try learning with your favorite movie characters. English courses, interactive lessons with scenes from famous movies and TV series, best-selling books and word games, all in one place. Ewa app. Try app.ewa.com. Now, don't forget to subscribe for more English audiobooks like this. And now, let's listen to another story.